Hello, Pete.
Hey Chris, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you. Good. Thank you. Pete Carvill, the reason I want to talk to you today is because I've just finished your book, which is Death of a Boxer, which is highly recommended. Um, I would recommend anyone buys it. Even if you're not a boxing fan, I would recommend you purchase this. Um, Excellent book, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. But
Thank you for
before
the
we
kind
do,
words.
can we just start on your journey? Like, have you always been a fan of boxing? And what prompted you to write the book in the first place?
Sure. So I got into boxing when I was about 19 or 20. And the reason I got into it, as I sort of said to a few other people, was I moved away from home at the age of 19. That was literally the day after my 19th birthday. And I moved to a town in the north of England where I was going to university. And it was a rough town in places. And I went to work in the bars and the nightclubs and I started hanging out with these like tough guys. And I was a skinny, nerdy, pardon me, 19-year-old, and I wanted to be a man. And so what I did was there was a boxing gym I went past, and I kind of had always seen it and fancied thought, oh, I wouldn't mind having a go with that. And I went to this boxing gym and I was hopeless. But at the same time, I was hooked. And I started training, 2, 3 times a week. I was doing sparring. I started lifting weights. I put on about 20 pounds of muscle in a couple of months. And then I picked up a book called On the Ropes by Jeffrey Beatty and books of ever on boxing. And I read that and I was in the gym and I was becoming a man and I thought, this is it. And my life changed from that moment. And I just became obsessed with boxing. I was obsessed with it for years and years and years. And it gave me everything I got in life since that time. I got direct reporter. And the way I trained as a newspaper reporter, I trained as an apprentice. And when I was interviewing for my apprenticeship, and they said, "Well, do you have any stories you've written?" Well, what did I have? I had stories on boxing, and that's what got me my first apprenticeship job, which got me into working in journalism, which got me eventually into the FT, and then I went freelance. But the difference between the Pete before boxing and the Pete after was I developed this work ethic of always turning up, always putting the best in, because I learned it from boxing because that's how I saw results. And then when I took that same work ethic and applied it to other things, that's when I actually started achieving things. So I owe everything to boxing, directly or indirectly. Where this book comes in is in 2018, 19. I was thinking about, I wanted to write a book. This was before the pandemic. So when the pandemic happened, I had to put everything aside for 2 years. And I came across a story of Mike Towell. And I read the report from the fatal accident inquiry in Scotland into his life and death. And I thought, this is a great story. And I sort of started looking at it and start like making timelines and stuff up. And then after the pandemic, I came to London for work and I had a drink with an old friend of mine. And he said, "Well, what do you do now?" And I said, "Oh, I write for the B2B, business to business magazine. So occasionally do a bit of breaking news out of Germany, which is where I live now." And I said, "Well, one day I'd love to just sit and write books." And my friend said, I know these guys at Bite Back who are really nice and they do non-fiction. If you have something, send it to me. I'll forward it to them. And you've got an introduction. And I said, okay. So I did the first meeting with the guys, and I was talking about my 20 something years in boxing at that point. And they said, "Well, go and do an outline of what you want to write, and we'll take it from there." I said, "Okay." So I went away and I did the outline, and then I came back and I gave it to them. And at that time, the outline was just about Mike Towell. And they looked at it and they said, "Look, it's a good story, it's an interesting story, but really it's not enough to justify a whole book." And I said, okay. And they said, well, what you should do is go away and think about how you can expand it and what other stories you could put in, what other sort of people you could talk about, what issues you could talk about. And I said, okay, I'll do that. So I went away and I spent a week putting together things that I remember from my life in boxing and so ideas about what I'd like to cover. And then I went back and they said, great, let's go for it. And that's really how the story of Death of a Boxer begins. Um, Book took about a year to write. There's a few pieces in it that appeared in other magazines like Boxing News. or appeared online in various places that we sort of folded into the book itself. And I spent a lot of that time on the road. I was in the US, Sweden, Poland, Spain. I was in the UK 3, 4 times. I was in Scotland as well. Um, yeah, there was a lot of nights and a lot of hotel rooms. But it was fun. I'm not going to lie to you. It was fun.
So that's how you got to the book. Obviously, you talked about Mike Towell, and he's basically the layer that covers the whole book. Even though it's
Mhm.
not specifically about him, it covers the whole book. I'm just wondering, this particular topic, like the title of the book, obviously is Death of a Boxer. What made you write? Was Towell the entry into that, or was it something where you thought, actually, was it something that conflicted your love of boxing with what you were seeing in the ring?
No, the book, as I said, started out. It was solely going to be about Mike Towell, and the touchstone on that was I wanted to write a boxing version of Into the Wild, which is John Krakauer's classic book about a young man searching for masculinity and ultimately perishing through misadventure. And I thought there was interesting parallels there. So that's what brought me to the story of Mike Towell. But really, the backbone of that, and it's the backbone of the research from it. There was After the inquiry into his death, there was 163-page report into what had gone on. And when you read it from start to finish, which is what I did because I'm a sort of a nerd like that, it's like, okay, there's an interesting story here. There's an interesting story about what it means to not only be a boxer, but what it means to be a man. And that was the crux of it. So it's not really a story about boxing so much. It's the love stories about men and about how men relate to each other and about how you can take a boy and you turn him into a man and do it in a way that's constructive and not with his honor and his discipline and respect and self-respect. So I'd like to think it touches on themes that are much deeper than just a sports story.
Yeah, indeed. And as I say, what I like a lot about it is it's not just, I mean, Mike Towell I'd heard of, I've seen in this country what happened to him, but you
Mm.
don't just go into like the main names, you go into various gyms, speak to various people, and do exactly as you say, which is you talk about the what boxing can afford people and so on and so forth. And it kind of reminded me of another book I read, which is something similar, because you do touch a lot on CET as well.
Mhm.
How did that research go, and who did you speak to with regards to that?
On the brain damage stuff. So there's a few interesting stories here. So I reached out to the Concussion Legacy Foundation in the States, and I said, I'm doing this book. I'd like to write about the work being done by your foundation. Is it be okay to come to Boston to see you? And they said, of course, right? So they arranged for me to come to Boston. They gave me a date, and it was in July, I think. And um, so I started making plans to come to the US, and they were going to give me a tour of the brain bank, and I was going to meet the head doctor. I thought, wow, this is amazing, but I couldn't really justify, as good as it was, going to the US solely to do that, that 1 day tour of the brain bank. So I had to find other things. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to reach out to a former fighter who was in the, suffering these issues and talk to them about what was going on. And as you can imagine, it's a fairly delicate subject if you want to talk to someone who's suffering from the degenerative brain condition like CTE. And so um, one of the boxers I reached out to multiple times was Mickey Ward. Mickey Ward, as you know from the fights of Arturo Gatti, Mark Wahlberg played him in the film. And I had email for Mickey and I had phone number as well that someone gave me that was his. And I called and emailed and tried various ways to get through, and I couldn't never get through to him because couldn't reach him. And I was on the verge of giving up on that part of the book. I thought, look, I'll just cancel the meeting in Boston. I won't spend a couple of grand flying over. I'll just find a way around it from a European perspective. And then in the final last ditch attempt, about 3 weeks before I was supposed to go out, I reached out to um, the Concussion Legacy Foundation again. And I said, hey, do you have anybody in the program that you think would speak to me? Because I know that Mickey's already in the program, but he didn't want to speak to me. And they said, well, there's a guy in Pennsylvania called Alan Blywise, and we're pretty sure he'll speak to you. So they gave Alan my email address, and then Alan emailed me back the same day, and he said, come to Pennsylvania. come hang out with me, come see my friends, come see my life as it is now, and I'll tell you everything that you need. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. So I got on the plane and I went to this to New York first, and I spent a few days in New York catching up with fight friends of mine. And then I went up to Boston for a few days and saw the brain bank. And then I went down to Pennsylvania to visit Alan. And as soon as I walked in, Alan is such an incredibly nice guy. He shook my hand. He said, "It's so good to have you here. I know everybody in boxing around the northeast of America. I'll put you in touch with anyone you want." And I said, "Oh, that's very nice." And he said, "Yeah, actually, I'm really good friends with Mickey Ward. I'll put you in touch with Mickey Ward." So the guy I actually wanted originally, I didn't get, but I got Alan instead. And Alan's so good that I didn't need anybody else afterwards.
Gosh, I mean,
Mm.
he's quite a character in terms of how we feel like about boxing, because on the one hand you say you've got the whole brain damage, but he's still using it as a way to bring like young boys, like boys and young men up, and like I said, give them the discipline that you describe as well. And yet overall he's still smoking as well, which is some of the funnier parts of the book. He seems like a real character to be around.
Oh, he's brilliant. He's such a nice guy. And Alan, I don't know how much you've read of his part of the book, but like Alan had two fights as a pro after a really good amateur career, and then he lost both fights, didn't work out for him, and then he ended up as a professional sparring partner, and he went around all the big heavyweight camps of the 1990s, and he's now suffering the effects of that. But he's obviously got his physical difficulties. He called me. We spoke on the phone, so and he said, come over, and he spent all his time with me that he didn't have to do. And he introduced me to his family, introduced me to his wife. He was just becoming a grandfather when I went over to see him, and he brought me, which is what boxing people do. Boxing people are so good like that. And I still speak to him now. Like we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago. Where I said I was going to try and get back to the States this year, and he said, come over, come stay with me. And honestly, like the next time I go to the States, one of the main reasons I go is just to go to see Alan and see the guys at the Five Stones gym. Because in a way, it's become like a second home for me. I think about it every day at the moment.
Yeah, yeah, I imagine so. And that's one thing I do like about boxing is the characters that are involved. Unlike other sports, everyone seems to be on a level, whether you're a world champion or an area level title. There seems to be a bit of camaraderie in boxing, which you don't seem to get anywhere else.
Yeah. So one of the guys who's in the book, and he's fairly minor in the book, and I love him dearly. It's a guy called Eric Skoglund from Sweden. And about 3 4 years ago, I was looking to do some more long form stuff, and I wanted to write about a boxer. And then I'd heard of Eric's story, and so I reached out to Eric over his website, I think it was, and it took a few weeks before he came back to me. And he said, "Come to Sweden, come hang out with me in Sweden, and write what you want." So, oh, great. So I went up to Sweden and hung out with him for a couple of days and wrote a story on that. A big chunk of it appears in the book. And then when I was doing and we stayed in touch. So when I was doing the book last year, I was speaking to him and said, "Look, can I put you in the book again?" He's like, "Yeah, that's fine, yeah." And then we were talking, and he said, "Well, what else are you doing while you're doing the book?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to Poland in a few weeks. I'm going to go to the Alexander Usyk Daniel Dubois fight." And Eric said, "Oh, that's such a shame. I can't be there. But my friend's fighting on the undercard. Let me put you in touch with him." So Eric put me in touch with Anthony, who's in the book. And that's how the connection was made with Anthony. But as soon as Eric called Anthony and said, "Hey, I've got a friend called Pete's doing a book. Do you want to be in it?" Anthony just said, "Look, any friend of Eric's is a friend of mine." And next thing you know, I'm walking out in front of 35,000 people in a stadium in Poland with a guy I met 2 hours ago. Incidentally, I spoke to Anthony 2 hours ago today because I was in London and met up with another mutual friend of ours, and we had a bit of a chat. And yeah,
God. It is incredible, and that shows in the book like your enthusiasm for the sport. Yes, there is a lot
mm,
about the whole issues with injuries and CT, but your enthusiasm for the sport as a whole really does shine through. I believe that's one of the
yeah.
strongest.
I look, I am not looking at rose tinted glasses. I know what boxing does to people. I know. I've seen it firsthand. I've seen people have been hurt. I've seen the scars. I've carried injuries myself. My back's not in great shape. My ankles are shot. But everything I got through life, I got through boxing, and I got through the self discipline it taught me. And I see what it does with the young kids. So in my hometown of Runcorn, which is a big part of the beginning of the book, the kids were stabbing each other. You had kids dying on the streets. And here's a question, right? You got two kids, one stabs the other, one dies. The other one goes to prison for 15 years. Nobody wins. You take those two same kids, you put them in a ring, you teach them self-discipline, you teach them to respect each other, and eventually, once they fight, they will become friends. That's what always happens. Is that not a better outcome than the first scenario? I would say it is. At the same time, I do not like to see children getting hit in the head.
Yeah. I'm
You
hoping
have
with
to sit.
modern
Go
techniques,
on.
hopefully, will change all that. So there's less sparring, or there's certain ways you can negate. It might be some sparring, obviously, but
Mm.
hopefully there's less ways you can injure yourself like during. Because really, it's the sparring more than the fights in many respects that creates a
Oh
lot of
yeah,
injuries.
yeah. I mean, I've been in gyms all around Europe, and you see the differences in some gyms. Like some gyms when I was in London at the Fitzroy Lodge, they only did body sparring, which I think is actually fairly sensible. If you're like me, just like an enthusiastic amateur, right? That makes more sense to body spar. But I've been in gyms in Germany where you see these guys have absolute knockdown, drag out wars, and you see them bleeding, you see them cut, lips have got noses are broken, lips are cut. That's not good for you, right? You can't be having those kind of hard spars all the time. Like my friend Trish, who's in the book, did a lot of hard sparring, and mentally she's fine. But here's the thing: is that she's covered in injuries. Like her shoulder is shot, so injuries to her hips. She's got injuries to her hands. But you can't. The human body's not really designed to do that stuff at all. Never mind over a long sustained period.
Is Trish the lady in the book who she goes back to Berlin for the first time in like a decade, and she's now
That
got a son or whatnot? Yeah,
yeah, that's Trish. Yeah,
yeah.
the
Is
thing
that
is, gone.
I was gonna say, was it boxing she did, or was it MMA, or was it no Muay Thai, wasn't it? Muay Thai.
Muay Thai. She was a Muay Thai fighter, Trish. Yeah. The thing with Trish, I trained with Trish about 12 years or so ago, and we used to beat lumps out of each other in the gym. And the thing with Trish is that, and I think it's in the book, is that she's a really, really hard person to like because she's so nice. Everyone falls a little bit in love with her, and it was so lovely as part of writing the book that I got to see her again after all this time, and we got to catch up and compare injuries and compare the things that we used to do, and we'd say things that it must have sounded horrendous to people who were there because I'm saying, hey, do you remember that time I punched you in the face and you thought your nose was broken? She was going, yeah, I remember that time I hit you in the body and you went down to one knee. People overhearing us must have thought we were some kind of pair of psychopaths. Um, but what came out that meeting, and I don't think it's in the book, was as we were leaving, Trish and I, from this bar, I we were talking about how much we missed it, how much we missed being that young, and how much we missed fighting. And I said to her, "Do you want to just punch me one last time, just for old time's sake? Just lay one on me before you leave." And she went, "Okay," and she did. She punched me.
Yeah. And what happened after that? You go down.
No, 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 no. She didn't punch me that hard. God, if she'd hit me, like she used to be able to hit, God, I would have gone. Nah, nah. It was a friendly, like, you know.
Okay.
But it's just boxing people. That was just, yeah. I was like, go on, do you want to just hit me one last time, just for old time's sake, just to feel that again, feel that thing again. Okay, dunk.
Going back to Mike Towell, one of the things that is quite disturbing in the book is in the lead up before his final fight and tragedy. It's his denials all throughout that. Like when he's going to the doctor and he's saying, "Oh, he has to be almost coaxed out of information from the doctor." So
Mm.
saying, "Oh, did you do this?" And he'll say either no or saying, "Yeah, okay, I did that." There seem to be signs all the way through, but he's in a state of denial. So you look at it and you think, what more could doctors have done in that regard?
Well, it's tricky because a lot of it will come under data protection, and I'm not an expert on data protection, so I don't want to say they should have done X, Y, and Z. I mean, what's happened since is that the British board has changed the rules now, where they do require that you give permission for them to contact your GP, your doctor, in case they need more information. So that's been a welcome development. How that works practically, I don't know. In terms of what Mike Towell did, I mean, yeah, like it's not in dispute that he lied. But the question that's not the interesting question. The interesting question is, why did he lie? And I never knew Mike Towell in life. I know people who knew him, who were friends with him, who I've spoken to a lot for this book, and the reception from all of them has been very positive. But what I think it is that Mike Towell was a boxer. That's how he saw himself. That's what he was supposed to be. That's probably what he thought he was here on this earth to do. Now you take away what a man does, and you kill a part of himself that never comes back. So if he'd had been honest, if he'd said, you know, I've got this going on, I've got that going on, they would have taken away the part of him that made him what he was or what he thought he was. You know, it's akin to killing a man. Now, the common sense approach, which I think everyone who reads it would know, would be that if he's having these problems, that he would have just said, I can't do this anymore. There's something going on with me. But he didn't. And that's the interesting question of Death of a Boxer is, why would you do that? And I think it really is about identity. It's about the fact that he was so he was so the idea of being a boxer, having a boxing license, of getting into the ring was so wrapped up in his sense of identity that he didn't see anything else that he could have done. And it's a tragedy. There's no other way to look at it apart from being a tragedy. There are some few good aspects as to what came afterwards, but none of it was related to his passing. For example, the family became good friends with his opponent from that night, Dale Evans. They're still quite close, and that's a positive that came out of it. But my God, it's a positive I don't think anyone wanted.
Yeah, it's one thing you see in boxing where when boxers retire, they really do struggle. A lot of them to like get that buzz, but compared to other athletes,
Yeah,
even if they've got all them, and this is a weird thing, even and it doesn't matter whether you're an area level title, like I said, you're a world champion that's earned millions. Even if you're at that level, there seems to be a lot harder to basically give it up, no matter what damage you've accumulated.
yeah. Part of it's financial. A lot of these guys carry on because they don't have any money. Um, you know, they might earn a couple. You know, they might earn a lot for one night, but then once the losses start building up, that money quickly tails off. So there's definitely a financial aspect there. But there's also a part like, and this is what I try to get across in the book. Fighting is fun. When you take away the risk of death, as it were. So, for example, if you get into a fight, if you get in a bar, you get into a fight, and go out into the street, there's every chance you could be killed. Someone could pull a knife, they could jump on your head when you're on the ground, right? So you take all that away, that risk of death, and it's just the idea of fighting within a controlled environment. Fighting is the greatest feeling in the world. As I've said, I think it's in the book, and I've said in other places. If you've never been 25 years old and fighting at your physical peak, then the universe owes you an apology because it's fun. And I miss it. I'm 43 in a couple of months and I still miss it. I still miss being in the gym and I miss sparring and I miss going in against some big monster who thinks he's going to rip me apart and probably will. And getting hit by him and looking at him and smiling and saying, come on, fucker, let's go. Right. And you see the soul break a little bit when they realize they've punched you and they can't hurt you. I miss that. I miss that split second when you see a guy's hand drop and you know you can put your hand in that gap and you can do it and you can knock him back in his heels and make his face shake. I missed that split second as well. I would give almost anything to go back to being 25, but I can't. And that's the problem that a lot of us have is we want to go back and we can't and we don't know how to deal with it properly.
Yeah, I mean, I've sparred a few times, not a lot. I sparred in my very early 30s, and not to say I miss a sparring, but
Mm,
I understand where you're coming from in terms of just missing the training, just missing on the pads, missing
yeah.
on the bags, missing all that. I mean, I do exercise now, and I go to the gym, and I did yoga for over 10 years. I'm looking to go back
Mm,
into it, and I enjoy both. But I'd say the boxing training by a country mile I liked because it encompasses everything, and it's one of them. I think it's a sport which is the most innate of
mm.
all sports, more than any of, with the exception of possibly athletics if you're running or jumping because you don't naturally. But yeah, I do get why people miss it, but it's a fine line, like going from where do you stop the line because there's a point where if you don't stop, it could become less enjoyable. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is a point where it becomes uncomfortable. Especially when I hit my limit, I think when I was 34. Yeah. I was a few months away from turning 35. I was in the gym. I dropped my hand in the first round, and this guy absolutely for months on end. I'm going to stop this soon. I'm going to stop this soon. I'm going to stop this soon. And he absolutely banjoed me. And I had this headache for 2 or 3 days. And I thought, why are you doing this to yourself? What are you going to do at this point that you haven't already done? And so I stopped and I walked away. But it's hard. It's hard to do that. And then as you get older, and then, as I said, I'm about 8 years old and now I've done what I was then. I go to fights now and I watch people fight, and it's difficult to watch those people fight because you know what's coming down the road for them, and you know it's probably not going to end well. But at the same time, I'm not entirely reformed. Like as soon as they announce a big fight, usually when I'm at home, I'll go, "Ooh, that looks good. I wonder if I can get a ticket for that. I wonder if someone will commission me to write a story about it," and then I'm off again.
Yeah, yeah. And that's one thing I will say to people as well, especially TV in a way sanitizes boxing because
Yeah.
if you the first fight I went to was a European title fight at York Hall, and
Mm,
he got stopped. One guy won and he got stopped. It was John Faxon versus Yuri Romanoff, got many years
right.
ago, and he got stopped because Faxton's face was just cut to shreds. On
Mm,
TV, I've seen fights that have been cut to shreds, fights like many cuts before, and you can clearly he looks gruesome. Then, trust me, when you're nearby, and I'll give advice to people, it actually in person, it looks absolutely tragic. It
yeah.
really, really does. And yeah,
It's,
despite this, you've got to go for more and more and more.
mm. Boxing speaks to an innate part of ourselves, right? So I know it's in the book that if you have a bunch of guys playing basketball in a street corner, like people will stand and watch it, but if a fight breaks out in the other street corner, everyone stops and goes to watch the fight, right? So it's primal, right? There's definitely an instinct, a primitive part of ourselves is always turned on by two people fight. Now, when it comes to television, television sanitizes it because what television does is it takes away the commentary and it puts back the sounds and the sounds of a hand hitting someone's head and that smacking sound. And you get that, but you also get the crowd a lot more when it's live, and you can see the crowd oohing and ahhing and shouting and screaming, and goes back to being gladiatorial. Now, I was in 2006. I was in Manchester, and I went to watch Joe Calzaghe fight Jeff Lacey for the as a unification 168-pound titles, and Lacey was going to absolutely walk through Calzaghe. That's what the smart money said that night. What happened that night? Joe Calzaghe put on a masterclass. He absolutely outboxed Lacey for all 12 rounds, and he essentially finished Lacey as a top level fighter. Now, I was there that night. I was about 100 yards or so from the ring, and I heard every single one of the more than 1,000 punches land on Jeff Lacey's head. And it was like a watermelon being hit with a cricket bat. Oh, it was just primal. But you could hear the sounds from over 100 yards away. Slap, 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 slap. Right? And Lacey was never the same again. He had, I think, two more fights at the sort of top level. Didn't look good tonight. One got injured, and then just became the guy that turned up to get knocked out by a bunch of B-rate fighters. So yeah, the TV sanitizes it, and the TV removes you from it. But when you go live for a big fight, especially if you're ringside and you see this wall of noise that comes down, there's no other feeling in the world like it. Especially if it's the heavyweight championship of the world. So in 2012, I just got married, and a week later, I went to be ringside for Vladimir Klitschko versus Mariusz Vuk in Hamburg. And they were doing this big production because Sylvester Stallone was there, and he was promoting this new Rocky musical that was opening in Hamburg. And the fight started, or the entrances started, and Vladimir Klitschko walked out with 5 or 6 belts being held up behind him, and the whole place, 12,000 people, went completely crazy. And the only thought in my head was, this is the heavyweight championship of the world. There is no other feeling like it. The air moves at a different frequency when it's a heavyweight title fight. It moves in different frequency when it's just two heavyweights fighting, just in the gym. But a heavyweight title heavyweight championship title fight, the whole planet stops, and you might as well just be on a different planet for an hour. It's an incredible feeling. Everyone at some point in their life should go watch the heavyweight championship in the world.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is like I can imagine, like, for a lot of people, a massive adrenaline rush. And it was
Mm.
interesting going back to CET when you went to the States to that center. There was one doctor who surprised me actually because she said she thinks it's barbaric boxing
Hmm.
and she's seen the damage it's done to it, but she still doesn't think it should be banned. Did that surprise you that she said that?
Uh, no, honestly, no, it didn't surprise me that she said that. She's obviously Anne McKee is also she's a really super one of the nicest people in the book is Anne McKee. I don't know why she exactly says I can't remember offhand why she says she doesn't want to see it banned. But here's the thing: if you ban it, you can't ban it effectively. All you can do is manage it. So let's say you ban it in England, right? You ban it in England. Well, what happens then? Well, England's a fairly well regulated boxing industry. So everyone who's regulated in England who can no longer work, what do? Well, they're going to turn up in places like Sarajevo, Serbia, Estonia, Latvia, places where basically all you need is a pulse to get a boxing license. You see this now with Danny Williams, who beat Mike Tyson back in 2004. Danny Williams is still, up until I think last year, was still turning up in places and getting beaten up for a couple of rounds because he needed the money. And he was doing it in places like Latvia, which would give him a license, even though nobody else on the planet would. So here's what happens: you ban boxing, well, everyone goes abroad and they start fighting in places where it's not that well regulated, and more people get hurt. And then if you ban boxing as well, you got to ban every other sport that damages the brain. So you got to talk about MMA's got to go, karate, rugby union, rugby league, football. You got to get rid of headers in football. The only thing you can do is you have to educate people about the damage that it can cause. And the problem there is that you're trying to get people to budget for a future they may not have to pay for. Would I want to see boxing banned? No, because I don't. I think the alternative is much worse. It becomes unlicensed, it becomes unregulated. It happens in different jurisdictions. No, you're going to remove something from young men, and it's young men that impacts more than young women. You're going to remove away from them to learn how to be men. So, do I want to see it banned? No. Would I be upset if it ended tomorrow and it no longer existed? Probably not. And it's a complexity I'm still dealing with even today. And here's the thing: is I've been offered multiple times. People have said to me, "Oh, we've got a kids class running. Do you want to come down and teach the kids hold pads, show them how to jump rope?" Right? And I always say no because I wouldn't teach a relative of mine to box as a child, and I wouldn't do it to anybody else's child either. It's complicated. As I said, I'm still working out. I wrote a whole book of me trying to work it out.
Yeah, it's sure it's complicated. I wrote someone asked me to write a pamphlet last year about boxing. And I talked about like similar to what we've discussed in this interview,
Mm,
making people given discipline and so on. But I started that pamphlet with it was on Good Morning Britain over here, and there
right.
was a conversation with Eddie Hearn and the chief executive of Headway, which is a charity that deals with people who suffer from traumatic brain injury. And obviously, you can tell where the conversation's going,
Mm,
where Eddie Hearn was saying, yeah, you know, boxing's very good and so on and so forth. And this person said, because of damage to the brain, it's really bad. A little bit more complex than that, but that was a general
yeah.
gist. And I start off the pamphlet by stating that. And one of the things I don't do is, and you haven't done in your book, is shy away from that at all. Because it could be easy for someone to say, yeah, well, it gives men character, it gives them discipline, which it completely does. And I've written about that and I've told people this. But it is a conflict in that, like, I wouldn't want it to be banned because what would they do? Especially now, I think, because there's less manual jobs now. So it's like, where would you go? I don't know. It's conflicting, but then there's a side of me that thinks there is quite a lot of good going to come from out of this as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, there is a lot. I mean, the whole thing of the book is that complexity. I mean, what's the tipping point? mean, as you see in the parts of the book that deal with Runcorn, they're doing a great service to these kids, and the guys that run it, the guys that run these kids classes in Runcorn, it does a great service to them as well. Like gives them a purpose and a focus in life. But then if you look at the other end, you see the guys who get damaged, and you see the guys who are in their 50s and start to have problems. You have to question: is it okay? And the thing is, I don't know. Like on Monday it might be, on Tuesday it might not.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, it is very complex. And interestingly, you said one of the places you went was Sweden, which had a ban on boxing until a few
Mhm.
years ago.
Yeah.
What is the boxing scene there now after that ban's lifted? Is there restrictions still, or do you know anything about that at all?
So when it was lifted a few years ago, so originally it was banned from about, I think, from the 1960s. And what happened was they did come back in, and they had amateur boxing, or they call it diplom boxing, over in Sweden, which is essentially fencing with fists. You know, they just jab, right? And so when it came in, I think it came in back in about 15 years ago on the professional side, and they said you can do, I think it was like 6 2-minute rounds. So it was really quite short compared to what sort of standard boxing is elsewhere around the world. That's gradually increased now. At the same time, um, it's not a huge scene in Sweden. They do have some good fighters, but they've also had a lot of injuries as well. So Eric, obviously, there was Swedish fight. Sweet, I can't remember her name now. She was called the Golden Girl. Um, she was injured as well. I think that was a fight in Stockholm. There was a guy called Arthur Krang who was also injured in Sweden. So it does exist. It's never really had a huge fan base in Sweden. Most Swedish fighters tend to go abroad, and they tend to fight in different places. There's another fighter called Maria Lindbergh who also had a bleed on the brain as well. So theirs is not a huge boxing industry. They actually have very good boxers, considering there's not much of a history of it, and Sweden's a fairly small country. But yeah, it's not a huge industry. Whereas in Germany, which is where I live now, Germany used to have a huge boxing industry,
Yeah.
and now it doesn't really have much of one. It's very rare that you get a big fight now in Germany, certainly not the levels that they used to have. So if you go back to 2009, 10, 11, you have both Klitschko brothers were fighting in Germany, and the younger one, Vladimir, was often selling out the big stadiums. So when he had his fight against David Hay, 2011, I think it was, he was fighting in Imtech Arena in Hamburg, which is 50, 60,000 people. And then he went off, he had fights in like Mannheim, and I think it's the SAP Arena in Mannheim, which is another 50,000 people or something like that. So Germany had this huge boxing industry, and gradually it's kind of faded a little bit. And there's reasons for that. It just means it's a little bit harder to watch good fights now.
Yeah, I remember it as a teen in the 90s, teenager. Obviously, you talk about the Klitschko's, but even before that, Sven Acker and Felix Sturm, and then Arthur
Mm.
Abraham was adopted by Germany during his career as well. As you say, I mean, I've got some boxers that are well known, like Christian Hammer, for instance. Ajit
Yeah,
Kabai, I think, is from there as well.
yeah,
But
he
like,
is. Yeah,
it's not got the scene that he used to have. Um,
no, strange enough, Felix Sturm is still fighting.
yeah, yeah,
He's in his mid 40s and still fighting. He had a couple of years ago that I went to, that I think was one of his. He lost that one, but it was one of his best fights. Yeah, but the scene has definitely faded, as you say. Sven Ottker's long retired. Jurgen Brain was retired. Abraham retired. Marco Huck keeps announcing fights that he then cancels because something comes up, like he gets injured, or I think it's always injuries. But yeah, like, so he has one booked for July, I think it is, in Berlin, and I'm kind of holding my breath, or not holding my breath, shall we say, on whether that one comes off.
yeah. It seems unlikely, and I think he's at the age now where you could argue he should retire anyway.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think he's like 38, 39. I think he's looking for that one last big payday to finish off his career with, which I get. And actually, talking about Marco Huck, and I've written about Marco Huck before in different places. Marco Huck is probably, and I don't mean to disrespect to Marco Huck because I like him very much. He was a very weak champion at cruiserweight, and he had something like so many defenses. I mean, I think I can't remember how many it was. Let's say it was 15. The the most amazing thing about Marco Huck is not that he successfully defended 15 times, but that he could find 15 guys who couldn't beat him. Um, but he always went in hard. Like when he left the Sauerlands, about 10 years ago, he left the Sauerlands. He decided he was going to go to the States. He's going to try and break the States, and then in his first fight in the States, which was a hell of a fight against Krzysztof Głowacki, he got stopped in I think like 8 or 9 rounds. And he's been trying to sort of recover his momentum since then. Yeah, but I don't see it happening. I think he's itching for one last payday. But yeah, he was never the greatest of fighters, but I always admired him because he always turned up and he always turned up in shape. And he was obviously trying to, do the best he could. Yeah, so we'll see. We'll see if that happens in a couple of months, if he does turn up to the Astro Center in Berlin. I hope he does. It'd be nice just for old time's sake to see him fight again.
So finally, what about yourself? Obviously, you've written this book, which I said again, I highly recommend to anyone, and I'll leave a link to the description of where you can buy it. But also, what about yourself? Are you still writing? Are you planning another book? Like, what's going on with you at the moment?
Yes. So I've got a couple of things in the pipeline. So I work full time as a writer. So I work mostly in business to business journalism. So at the moment, I've gone back to that. But at the same time, I've gone back to that because I took a year off. I needed to earn some money. Well, I'm also working on my second book right now, and that's due in with the publishers in October, and that one is called A Duel of Bulls, and this is about the friendship between Ernest Hemingway and Orson Welles, and it takes place over 25 years, set against the backdrop of Spain during the Spanish Civil War and what came afterwards, and it's going to tell the true-ish story of these two men and their friendship with one another. So that's coming next. And then after that, I'm hoping to do a travel one, which I'll go back up to Sweden to do. And that's going to see me travel what's known as the Sweden solar system, which is the largest scale model on the planet of the solar system. And it's 1,000 kilometers, begins in Stockholm and ends up in the Arctic Circle. So that one I'm also really looking forward to doing as well.
Just quickly then, on that Hemingway Orson Welles book, obviously
Sure.
Hemingway, again, another link to the boxing because he was a huge boxing fan himself, Hemingway.
Yeah.
But why was it about the friendship between Hemingway and Welles that thought actually this could be, well, first you actually liked and thought, and secondly, you thought actually I could write a book about this?
Well, there's a famous interview with Orson Welles from 1973 and 1974 on the TV show Parkinson. And he tells a story about when he first met Hemingway in 1937. And they met over a screening of a documentary called The Spanish Earth, which was about the Spanish Civil War. And they ended up getting into a fist fight about it. And then Wells said, oh, we were friends for the next 25 years. And I just thought, it's an amazing story. You have these two guys, both world famous, both incredibly influential in their own way, and they had a friendship, and it's never been explored in print. And I thought, well, I'm going to write that book. Now, the problem with writing that book is that both men were basically, we would say, unreliable narrators of their own lives. So they often lied and told lies and bullshit and made up stories. And I spoke to my publisher and I said, well, here's the way I'm thinking of doing this one, is that you can hear like a story from one and you hear a story from the other, and they're both really interesting stories, and then you can hear the truth, which is not as interesting. So why don't I just write all the interesting stuff and just call it, we'll just call it a good read rather than an academic work. And the publisher said, let's do it. So this one is going to be a lot more light-hearted than Death of a Boxer. There's going to be a lot more humor in this one. And it's just going to be a great adventure story of two of the greatest artists of the 20th century.
Cool. Pete, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thanks
All
for
the
having
very
me.
best with the book, and all the very best. And thank you very much for coming onto the podcast.
Great. Thanks for having me, Chris. Good to be here.
Of course.